Hi, I'm Stephen Carson, coming at you from St. Louis, Missouri, in these United States. I'll make it short and sweet, and we'll get to the content you're coming for, to more talk of monarchy versus democracy. Um, Something my producer encouraged. He said, "You all seem to subscribe." With there's ways to see who's watching the show and are they subscribed and stuff like that. The viewers of the show tend to be subscribers to the channel. So that is outstanding. Thank you. So what you can do for free to help us grow the channel is to like the videos, but only an honest like, please. Like the videos, share the videos, on Twitter or Facebook or whatever. Reach the boomers. And then for a not so free way to support us, we are primarily supported by contributions through Subscribestar and Bitcoin. And you can find both of those in the video description, the way to support us in that way. And that has really come in handy because I absolutely had to have a new computer for doing the show, and I was able to get it. And I'm almost able, with the help of the Subscribestar supporters, I'm almost able to afford the lights we need so that we stop having the fuzz behind me and everything. So that will be great, and I appreciate your support. Let's get to it. Hello, Ryan from Oklahoma.
Hello, how are you doing?
Doing very well. As I was mentioning to you, we're doing a fun family outing to a German area, so I'm feeling like I'm getting in touch with your roots. They're not my roots. I'm not German, uh, but my wife is actually. My wife's maiden name is rather
Well,
German sounding, and her grandfathers both spoke German to her when she was little. So major German roots for her and my children.
yeah, they're good roots too, so don't worry.
um, okay. Speaking of Germans, let's see. Knut Ledeen, who we focused on last week, was Austrian. We're gonna summarize his points in favor of monarchy in just a moment, and we're gonna turn to another German speaker this week to continue our case. Sort of, it's with Hoppe especially. We want to not de-emphasize a little bit how strong of a case it is for monarchy. It's more of a case for monarchy as opposed to democracy. That is, if you had to pick between the two, Hoppe's saying, here's some reasons why you'd pick monarchy. It doesn't mean that Hoppe's a monarchist. In fact, I don't think
Right.
Knut Ledeen was precisely a monarchist either, because like Hoppe, he was an anarchist. But they both thought that monarchy was preferable if you had to pick between the two systems. So that's really what we're talking about. Monarchy versus democracy, as it said on the 10, right? As it says on the title. Anyway, so Knut Ledeen was Austrian. And then Hoppe was East German, is where his family was from. And in fact, he has a German accent. If you ever listen to him speak, he came to the United States as an adult, and so he never lost his accent. That's for sure. So yes, we're drawing from some German-speaking thinkers, shall we say, for our case on monarchy. Okay, so and yes, I will be grilling some fresh bratwurst that I get from inside the German town we'll be visiting Saturday night. So that'll be nice. I'm gonna let the children each
Very
pick
nice.
their own kind of sausage, German sausage, for me to grill. Okay, so before we turn to Hoppe, I just wanted to catch us up. Part one of this discussion of monarchy versus democracy was last week. The link is in the description, so if you find the brief summary we give you here interesting, we talked about more at length last week. But real quick, themes. Feel free to jump in, Ryan, to expand if you feel like we need to say a little bit more to give the idea. But real quickly here, major themes in Knut Ledeen's case for monarchy. One is hierarchy and the family. These are sort of, in my way of reading it, kind of bound up. He's thinking about both hierarchy and family as opposed to egalitarianism, political egalitarianism, right? And so he says monarchy is more like the other social structures in our life, or traditional European life at least. Family, church, things like this. Well, heck, even the workplace, right? Um, in the workplace, we have hierarchy. People report to people, and there's bosses and bosses and minions and so forth, right?
Right. And then on the regard, the monarch can also act as a sort of a father figure almost, which is, at least in today's age, and after we've been through a century and a half of democracy, um, worldwide rather, it's something that's rather lacking, that you don't get in democracy, because democracy just naturally seeks to destroy the role of the father and the role of the mother, and seeks to equalize them into something that just is worthless.
Right. So one of the things he calls out here on this point is simply how unusual it is that in these various parts of our lives, the rest of our lives, we would be in family structures or some kind of hierarchical structure in a company or whatever, or in a church, right? He talks about spiritual fathers and so forth. Then we turn to politics and it's all egalitarianism and we're all the same and we're all brothers and there's no hierarchy or anything. He says that's kind of weird, isn't it? Like, why would it be that we would be able to just make such a sharp shift in how we function in the rest of our lives to how we function in this one sphere of our life? It seems it's a bit of a red flag, I feel like he was saying.
Right.
Okay, next he argues that the monarch has a factor of neutrality. It's interesting to bring this up, by the way, because some of our friends have been quite unhappy with the current monarch of the United Kingdom for seeming to break a long-standing policy of neutrality and come out for sort of one side of, the political debate, right? Well, maybe, I don't know, maybe they would have a little sympathy for Knut Ladin's view of the monarch traditionally. And by the way, I say Knut Ladin's view. He's trying his best. That's my take on it, Ryan. Like the perennial traditionalists, he is trying his best to channel what European monarchy meant throughout the ages. He's not trying to say, here's a funky new Knut Ladin way to do monarchy. Maybe he failed, and
Right.
that's what he ended up with, but that wasn't his goal, right?
He is a good historian insofar as he is not like claiming any originality or any new groundbreaking idea. He's not trying to sell something. He's just trying to expound upon an idea that's either been buried, lost, or mutilated throughout time. And that's what any good historian will do. They'll try to like show you not just like the boring facts that you get in history class, and they won't try to sell you something. They're trying to show you the idea, everything around it, how people interacted with it, and what you lose by taking it away. And he does it perfectly here.
Right. So he argues that the monarch can stand above or sort of outside of regular politics. One way to think about this, and I didn't emphasize this in my summary here, is that the king is not a party man. Okay. So you
Right.
would not properly think of the Queen of England, for example, as a Tory or a Liberal Democrat or a Labour Party member or a Socialist Party member or whatever. I'm sure they have many other parties, right? Or a Libertarian, for that matter. That's not what the role of the monarch is. They're meant to be a sort of above or outside of that kind of political contention.
Right. So, and what that creates is a whole sphere of operations that is above politics, so that you don't have, say you have a monarch functioning how it should be. If you do have these different factions that are vying against each other, in the modern age, they're Republicans and Democrats, or Conservatives and Labor Party members. But
Right.
Say that you have like an actual properly functioning monarchy, you now have another layer of extra political power that can actually interfere in it and stop them from doing something in the name of the monarchy or the country or whatever you have.
Right.
And it by nature puts it over it in like in a sort of extra dimensional sense, if you will. Like it's on a different plane.
So I highlighted this quote that Knut Ladin shared on Twitter. I used a different version of it, but Franz Joseph in talking to Teddy Roosevelt or an ambassador of Teddy Roosevelt, something like that.
Hmm.
The American said, what do you see the view of the monarch as in our modern times or whatever, right? You can hear the progressivism just in the way the question's framed. But anyway,
Right.
um, uh, and Franz Joseph said, I stand with my peoples against their governments or against their politicians, depending on the translation, I think, of his comments. Um,
Right.
and that I think he Franz Joseph was channeling that neutrality, that sort of outside of day-to-day politics view of monarchy. Okay, so next, Knut emphasized that the monarch bears personal responsibility. He is not abstract. So the king or the queen or whatever, the monarch and their family actually like own certain land, and people are in the army or whatever are meant to be loyal to the person of the monarch, as
Right.
opposed to, the flag or the United States federal government, whatever that means. It's meant to be a little more, medieval, right? Where there's these
Right.
personal relationships that undergird the structure of society. Go ahead.
It, it's a lot easier to hold Kaiser Wilhelm or King George accountable than it is Congress or the government whole. And we need to protect democracy and hold them accountable. Well, who are they? They're a list of nameless bureaucrats upon nameless bureaucrats, and at the top is the figurehead of the person that's supposedly elected. And we'll get into that potentially. Um, Whereas with the monarch, you have the monarch to hold accountable, and that's all that you have to hold accountable. It's right there, all out in the open. That's the person that you hold accountable if you are to do that.
Right. And he makes an interesting point that I never thought about. I meant to go back and read the Declaration of Independence to fact check him on this, but he says if you read it carefully, he says they actually are complaining about King George III. They're not
Right,
complaining about the monarchical system. They're saying you, King George III, have done this and this and this and this. So they're holding him responsible.
so I can defend that view of the Declaration. If you start attacking the institution of the monarchy itself, their whole argument for their actions falls apart because the whole reason that they were revolting, as laid out in the Declaration, was that King George III had infringed on or had failed to live up to his responsibilities, and this had harmed them as Englishmen. If the monarchy shouldn't have been an institution, if that was what they were going to argue, the Declaration would look very different, and they wouldn't be
Right.
arguing on the grounds that they were Englishmen and that George III was irresponsible. They would be saying that he shouldn't be there in the first place. The monarchy is bad. This is
Yeah.
why we're revolting, and you don't see that in the Declaration.
Right. So that's sort of startling, right? Because this is the problem with not having a good sense of history, right? It's very easy to read things anachronistically, to go
Right,
back and just sort of assume that this is a case against monarchy vaguely, without realizing that that's not how they would have been thinking at that time. As much as we think of it, the American Revolution, so called, um, they wouldn't have even been thinking that way yet. I mean, this is pre-French Revolution, right? Anyway, I thought
right,
that was a very interesting observation. And of course, I just love that kind of thing when people help me to break out of anachronistic thinking and try to see things a little more like they were truly being seen at the time, right? Break out of our
right.
present orientedness in our perspective, which we desperately need because something's clearly wrong with how we're seeing things these days. So we better try on some other ideas. Okay, another emphasis he makes, I won't go on about this one because Hoppe is going to bring it up. Preparation. The monarch is prepared for his role from birth. He isn't just randomly plucked out of being a game show host, say, to pick on someone who I'm actually sort of fond of, to become president, right? The monarch is prepared literally from birth to be in this role, to understand what his duties are, and prepared in a number of other ways, right? So that's interesting.
Right.
So go ahead. You want to comment on that?
As in, when we get there with Hoppe's chapter, there's an interesting point that I'd like to make because it kind of emphasizes just the declining quality of our leaders. Even if you take a monarch that isn't necessarily held up as the best and brightest,
Mm-hmm.
it still outclasses most of our leaders today, if not all of them.
Right. Yeah, it's like the historians do this stuff where they rate the presidents, right? And they always,
Yeah.
make the worst ones the top ones, right?
Yeah.
Lincoln, and all these horrible guys.
FDR, Wilson, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. The ones who are the bottom for people like me. Anyway, similarly, if you were to do this ranking of monarchs, you could go to the middle, is what you're arguing. You could go to the mean, the median monarch
Right.
in the list, and he would be head and shoulders of it. He'd be like a real statesman, thinking more long term, right? As opposed to what we do
Right.
these days. Yeah. Okay, international. He argues that monarchy was an international institution. It was, as you may know, they tended to marry across borders, and he explains why that is, in fact, why that tended to happen. They wouldn't marry someone from inside the country. They'd marry someone from another royal family over in a different country. And so there was this international relationship between the various monarchs and their families. Famously, Queen Victoria lost a child, at least one child, in when the Bolsheviks killed the Tsar's family. That was like her daughter, I think, who had married the Tsar and got shot or something like that.
And 2 points. I believe it would have been her grandchildren by that
sorry.
time. And
Okay, yeah.
and that strengthens the point because at that point all the royal families are related to her. It's not just like a daughter, it's all of them. And the other thing is that it strengthens international relations without sacrificing local identity or local determination, anything like that you see today, where internationalism is often brought about as a means to destroy identity and culture and everything, essentially everything that we love.
Right.
In this context, international relations is literally just fostering good relations and nothing else added.
Right.
The only thing that happens is a marriage.
Yeah, for good reason, we associate now globalism, internationalism, and many other sort of similar sounding words. We associate that with lots of things we don't like, right? But I think from Knut Ledeen's point of view, there was an internationalism that was more constructive and helpful in the old Europe. Right. Long lost at this point, I would say. Okay, this is a point that stuck out for me. He emphasized a sort of an anti-war kind of aspect to monarchy. One aspect of that is that under monarchy, you didn't see unconditional surrender. This is something that I'm really familiar with. The notion that unconditional surrender is modern and really terrible, really evil. I'm really familiar with that from reading antiwar.com and Justin Raimondo and Murray Rothbard and people like this. Many people may not think about it. They just assume that that's how wars have always been fought, But that's not true. A more traditional European war in the era of monarchy involved negotiation and a negotiated surrender, or maybe not even a surrender. Just, we're going to stop and you're going to have this and I'm going to have this and we're just going to, it's not like a winner versus loser thing. It's just, or winner or loser thing. It's just, we're done now. We're done with this now, right? Well, in the democratic age, we get the, you have to give us everything. There's no negotiation. The emperor doesn't get to stay on the throne or whatever. We will bomb you, we will nuke you until you give in on every single point, right? And Knut Ledeen says, number one, this is horrible, and number two, it's not something you saw in the monarchical age in Europe.
Right. So this could go into 1,000 different tangents because it's basically just it is one of the main things that separates the old age from the modern age.
Right.
What you see is that wars now, if you have someone that is sufficiently powerful, you expect them to completely take over and reshape the place that they're invading. The U.S. did it with every Middle Eastern nation that it intervened in. We did it with Japan and Germany in World War II. And World War I, we forced them to change their governments and redrew their borders, all this other stuff. It's something that you expect now. But if you look back into medieval warfare, whenever it did come to that, and you didn't have these world conflicts, it would be very, very localized. When it came to that, the nobles would finance the war themselves, or the king, if it was the king going off to war for his own interests, financed it himself. So if he didn't have the resources there, then you literally do not have the means to fight the war. So that's a limiting factor that you don't get today because of loans, deficit spending, nationalization, all these other things that come along with modern war. You don't get that then. And also something that you see is that they weren't going to take over the whole opposing kingdom. It was usually a land dispute. It was very legalistic in how it was fought. So a duke would usually fight over a castle with someone else. If the war was won, he just got the castle. He wasn't going for everything else because it was a legal dispute, if you will. And you got all these other small things. You had very, very tiny wars where, about a dozen people would die and the war would be over because it was over a tiny little objective. Right. It wasn't all or nothing, or it wasn't just stalemate and now you have, Iran sitting isolated on its borders because it tried to invade Iraq and killed hundreds of thousands of people for nothing. If there was a stalemate in these times, then you would come to a mutual agreement. Well, oftentimes they would help each other rebuild because if they're both weak, now they have to worry about whoever else is around them, and now they are both coming out at a loss, or they're coming out at if they repay each other, it's not as bad for either of them. So even stalemates look different.
Right. So this segues into the next point I was going to make or summarize here, which is that monarchs were just more limited in their exercise of state power. And you've already stated a number of the points that relate to this, but the larger sort of almost philosophical point is that we really live in the post-French Revolutionary era where there's this idea of the general will has seeped into all of our political thinking, and the state is supposed to sort of represent us in some cosmic sense, right? And that extends to the use of sanctions, right? Which is, hey, we don't like Saddam Hussein. He's a bad guy. You guys have him as your leader. And therefore, all Iraqis, their lives are forfeit. It's all bound up. You're all bound up together. As opposed to the notion that, Saddam Hussein is responsible for his actions. And he is to be held accountable. And the people of Iraq, they're a separate matter. Now it's all sort of mixed up together in a way that, well, it basically results in a lot more death of regular folks.
Right. And if I may, if I could, let's so we have the world wars, obviously. We don't need to enumerate how terrible they were. Someone has brought up a sentiment that might be shared by others in the chat. Well, something like the 30 Years' War, it had virtually no democracies at all in it, and it was rather destructive. Shouldn't, that's equally as bad. Well, they destroyed a certain part of Europe along a couple of rivers. Most other places were untouched. Most major kingdoms were neutral throughout. England famously didn't get involved. France wasn't involved in the 30 Years' War. It was internally focused at the time. Italy was focusing on its other things. So that one of the largest European wars before the age of democracy, discounting colonies and stuff like that were underdeveloped, it was just in Central Europe. And even then, the percent dead that came out of it was an order of magnitude lower than, what was it, a quarter of all Soviet men that died in World War II?
Yeah.
You don't get that in Germany, right? So, and even then, there were parts of Germany that were also neutral. You don't get that in a world war. You get rolled over, you join a side, or you, by the grace of God, you get Switzerland's geography, and no one wants to invade you. Those are the only ways that you can stay out of it.
Right. And by the way, if you're ever in Moscow, I recommend visiting these fountains that are there in memorial to all the people who died in World War II from the Soviet Union. And it's just, it's really simple. They're fountains that are lit up with red lights. So it looks like basically fountains of blood. It's something you'll never forget if you see it. Okay, last 2 points, then we'll turn to Hoppe. Knotleden argues that minorities tend to be sacrificed by majoritarian democracies, and they tend to be protected by monarchs. It's really easy to come up with lots of quibbling here, but he's talking about a broad tendency. He didn't even state it categorically in his book. He's just saying there's a tendency because the monarch is outside of politics, and they aren't so intimately bound up with, say, the major ethnicity in the kingdom. They're a little bit outside of that, right? They're international. They're cousin. Their name is German, even though they rule over England.
Right.
Right. So they might be more likely to not go so hard on the Welsh when they're the king of the United Kingdom, for example. Whereas an English, somebody who's very strongly associated with, I am English and it's the interests of the English people is all I care about. It'd be
Right.
different. So finally, one last one. And this segues right into Hoppe, because this is kind of the major thing that Hoppe has to say. The monarch is thinking about leaving the kingdom to his children. He rules for life rather than for a term. Right? Famously, monarchs typically rule until they die, or near the end of their life when they can't function or something. This means that the monarch brings a long-term view, so they can have foreign policy, for example, or other kinds of long-term plans, like a building that's going to take generations to build, right? A monarch can make those kinds of plans and have some hope of some sort of long-term consistency. Whereas what we see right now, for example, is, Trump sets things off in one direction and Biden just completely reverses it 4 years later, in terms of foreign policy or something like that. So you get a little more consistency, right. And whatever else can be said about it, about states, if they would be a little bit more predictable, sometimes that can help, just because everybody can then plan. Even if it's not great what they're doing, at least what they're doing, and you can kind of structure your plans around it. When things are just shifting and it's like, what should we do next year? I don't know. We've got an election. We got to kind of see who gets elected and what they
Right.
do, and then we can decide what to do with our business. It's not a great way to live, Okay, so I'm going to turn to the text, if you're ready for that, Ryan.
Yes.
Okay. So this is chapter 3 from Hoppe's book, Democracy, the God That Failed, which, considering that the book is literally just a collection of pieces, it wasn't written as a whole book. It was pieces written at different times and so forth. It's amazing how great it is to read this as a book. So I hope that this chapter gives you a taste for Hoppe and makes you want to read more. And this book would be a fabulous place to start if you get interested in Hans-Hermann Hoppe's work. I found the book mind-blowing. I mean, I had met Knotleden years before. So, it's not like it was the first time I'd heard some of these things. Nevertheless, reading Hoppe was really, it's just, you don't realize how baked in some of these ideas are until you read someone like Hoppe and realize that you've been thinking like this for so long,
Right.
So, let's see. Okay, did you want to, he starts kind of basically, he kind of starts with Mises and then quickly says, but I don't want to go further with this. I wasn't sure how much time I wanted to spend on this section.
Maybe to discuss, how Mises differed in his view of democracy.
Okay, yeah, right. So it's quite clear that on this point, well, it's a little hard to say where Rothbard was. I don't know that he wrote a lot about like democracy per se, but Mises and Hayek, representing a sort of an earlier generation of Austrian economists, and as you may have picked up on, and I think it was Bethke that made this, Pete Bethke that made this point. The Austrian school is a school of political economy. Yes, it has pure economics. Absolutely, that's the core. But Hayek, Mises, Rothbard, Hoppe, Joe Salerno, I mean, anyone you can think of, any of the big guys you can think of, they have more things to say than just about the pure free market. they have the theory of the pure free market, and then they turn to, the real world that is not the pure free market and analyze it, right? So it's a school of
Right.
political economy to a great degree. And so Mises and Hayek, representing this earlier generation of this school, I wouldn't say they sang the praises of democracy. They were not French revolutionaries, I think it's fair to say, even though Mises was sort of pro-French Revolution, it seems, in certain places. But really, when you read their thought, they're not really. That's not really the temper of their thought. Having said that, when they directly spoke about democracy, they'd kind of give it faint praise. Mises talked about it as being, a way to peacefully change regime and so forth. But what Hoppe wants to emphasize here is that, first of all, liberalism, which for Americans, when Mises says liberalism, think libertarianism. That's what he means by it. He says the program of liberal. I want to read this because this is a passage I remember underlining a long time ago, and it's always stuck with me. The program of liberalism, if condensed into a single word, would have to read property. That is, private ownership of the means of production. For in regard to commodities ready for consumption, private property is a matter of course and is not disputed even by the socialists and communists. All the other demands of liberalism result from this fundamental demand. I had at least one person say that, quibble with this and say, well, this is Mises kind of rewriting liberalism in the age of socialism and so forth. I'm not so sure. Having studied a number of the classical liberals, I think Mises knew what he was about here. Property is a really deep, important principle, and that's really how Hoppe thinks about it, as you'll see. Focusing on this issue of property is a real key to unlocking the nature of democracy versus monarchy, for example. Okay, so let's see. Tell me what else you want to hit on. I definitely wanted to read this mankind being what it is bit. Did you want to catch anything else here?
Yeah, that was where I was about to go to
Okay,
next.
yeah. Let me just read that. I love this. He says, mankind being what it is, murderers, robbers, thieves, thugs, and con artists will always exist, and life in society will be intolerable unless they are threatened with physical punishment. I love the quote. I think it's also worth emphasizing because some people misunderstand classical liberalism and libertarianism. And I've had people say this to me. Well, of course you think this because you're a pacifist or something like that. It's like, where did you get that from? The feeling I get from reading the classical liberals and libertarians is actually they are much more consistent, and one might even say harsh, in how they think that law and justice should be enforced. And they would view contending schools of thought as being either inconsistent or rather blasé about crime. Libertarians and classical liberals are not blasé about crime. They take it really seriously. And you'll hear this from Hoppe and Rothbard put it most colorfully, but Hoppe says things like crush the anti-fascist mob, which seemed really relevant last year. Rothbard says, unleash the police on this riot. They're law and order people. Okay, they're law and order people. I don't know how people misunderstand this. They just don't read them as the reality. They don't know.
Well, yeah, that's usually what it is. I've in the past couple of weeks, I've seen a lot where people will make an objection or have a question. It's answered on page 3 of whatever the relevant piece is.
Yeah, right.
So.
So compulsion has a place. It's just, the liberal or the classical liberal libertarian thinks very carefully about when it's appropriate and when it's not, right? But the idea that they just don't think there's going to be compulsion, they're not naive in that way at all.
Right.
So let's see. What else did you want to highlight from here?
So, just to give more light on Mises, if we want to defend him, he outlines in the next paragraph what he was in opposition to, which might differ from theory, perhaps.
Oh, which part?
So he says Mises' liberal opposition to the ancien regime of absolute kings and princes is worth noting here. Kings and princes were privileged personae. Almost by definition, they stood opposed to the liberal idea of the unity and universality of law. Thus, Mises stated the liberal theory of the state is hostile to princes. So that might be, it might get some more context, perhaps. So, he's not necessarily an apologist for the regime, but he's also not a Jacobin.
Mm-hmm.
So,
okay, and I guess the only other point, like I said, I didn't want to dwell on this too much. The major point here is that from the Misesian and Hoppian point of view, the point of the state is to, above all, is to protect property rights.
Right.
And the question is just how to organize it such that property rights are protected. Property rights is a little bit of a bloodless way of putting things. I prefer to talk about theft, plunder. You want a system where theft and plunder are minimized, because when there's a lot of theft and plunder, number one, it's unjust and wrong and bad. But number two, it back to that planning point, right? It's awfully hard to make long-term plans when you strongly suspect you're going to get robbed.
Yeah.
Like why build
on any level and in any capacity.
Yeah, why build a factory? Why start an ambitious new crop on your farm if you pretty much know that the Vikings or their modern day cop equivalents are going to come and grab your stuff? And the problem with that, of course, is that when people don't feel the safety and security to make long-term plans, it impoverishes society, right? People go back to living hand to mouth rather than what we've become accustomed to, which is that we benefit from capital accumulation and such things, Okay,
Right.
So wanted to make that point. Where am I? Okay, here we go. Now let's turn to, again, he talks about Mises' point. Okay, so I don't, so now let's turn, this is part 2 of the chapter, Ryan. Let's turn instead to the modern definition of democracy and the question of its compatibility with the foundation of liberalism, that of private property and its protection. And he says, here, wait a sec. My other computer keeps dinging. I'm going to stop that. Okay, there we go.
All right.
He says, let's see, it might be argued that Mises's definition of democratic government was applicable to the U.S. until 1861. Of course, Lincoln and the war between the states, right? Until
Right.
then, it was generally held as had a big emphasis on the right of secession.
Right, and that was his democracy, was the ability to secede. Yes.
Right. Which is a rather different definition than most people have in mind these days. So it was generally held until 1861 that the right to secession existed, and that the Union was nothing but a voluntary association of independent states. If you go to our Rise to Empire series, there's a playlist on the channel. We go through this story of the war between the states and the aftermath with Reconstruction and the road to empire. But with the crushing defeat and devastation of the secessionist Confederacy by Lincoln and the Union, it was clear that the right to secede no longer existed, and that democracy now meant absolute and unlimited majority rule. That is, a minority could no longer say, hey, you guys have gone too far. I know you voted, you won the vote or whatever, but that doesn't mean you get to do anything you want. There are limits to what the state ought to do, right? You've gone too far, and we're out. That was sort of an ultimate check.
Right.
That's certainly how Jefferson saw it, and a later Madison, right? The Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. They saw ways for the state to either say, well, nullification. Great book by Tom Woods on that, by the way. Nullification would say, the state would say, okay, well, you can make that rule, but it's not going to apply in our state, within our borders. So they could nullify the federal rule. and say, sorry, this is where we're not on board for this part of things. Or they could just outright leave. So both nullification and secession were at least threatened checks. And the North had threatened secession quite seriously under President Jefferson, right? Ryan? Am I getting that right?
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
I don't think it was Jefferson. It was.
You know what
It
I'm
was
talking
Madison
about.
or Monroe. Yes, and it was the
quite
Hartford
early.
Convention.
Mhm.
Yeah, it was the Hartford Convention, and there were multiple states in the Northeast, in particular, that threatened secession because they felt that the Federalist Party was being undercut through various different political maneuvers.
Well, and I also think there was a war that was going on that they weren't
Well,
happy with. But yeah.
yeah, there was, but that wasn't the only thing. Otherwise, it would have
Yeah.
happened a lot earlier.
Right, right. Okay, and he says, nor does it appear that any state since that time, so, turning away from the U.S. for a moment, no state has met Mises' definition of democratic government. All modern democracies are compulsory membership organizations. So it's like the Hotel California. You can check in, but you can never check out, right? That is
Right.
what democracy means now. Okay, so then he says, why didn't Mises think about this? But let's skip all that. So he's going to fill the gap left by Mises and provide an analysis of the logic of majoritarian democracy. That is, democracy as we know it, not some ideal democracy that someone has imagined, but democracy as we know it now in the modern era. So that's what we're going to deal with. So, without the right to secession, a democratic government is, economically speaking, a compulsory territorial monopolist of protection and ultimate decision-making, and is in this respect indistinguishable from princely government. Just as princes did not allow secession, so it is outlawed under democracy. So watch carefully what happens here, because recall, as we mentioned right at the beginning, Hoppe doesn't support, ultimately, monarchy. He's doing a comparison to draw out why democracy is so terrible, or worse than bad, as he says at one point, right? He's not doing this because he's just a big monarchist and wants to praise monarchy to the skies. What he's going to start with, in fact, is to point out the ways in which monarchy and modern democracy are really the same in a number of respects. And then he's going to draw the ways in which they're different. But you've got to start with what they share. So they don't allow secession, right? Both democratic government as well as princes possess the right to tax. That is, they both are permitted to determine unilaterally, without consent of the protected, the sum that the protected must pay for their own protection. And I'm sure he, in other places, he makes it clear that he's saying this is a protection racket, right? You better pay us the protection money, or something might happen to you, right? Well,
Right.
it's quite explicit. It's not even subtle. It's quite explicit what will happen to us if we don't pay the protection money, which they decide how much it is, right?
Right, and the thing is, and this is where I would say that monarchy might perhaps be more formal about it. In democracy, they will euphemize it as taxation in various different number of ways. But in a monarchy, they will literally formalize it to pay us tribute and we won't invade you, or something along those lines, or will protect you in different cases as well. So monarchy is more formal here, and it's not the greatest.
Okay, so now Hoppe is going to state something that is like 2 + 2 = 4 in economics. Okay, and that is that with monopoly, the price rises and the quantity and quality falls. The quantity and quality
Right.
of the product provided. This is just standard monopoly theory, basic stuff, right? And all he's doing is he's saying he's applying it to the situation of both princely and democratic government. So what does it mean in this case? They're both monopolies, right? They don't let you leave. You don't get an opt-out. So what is the effect of that going to be over time? The price of justice and protection will continually rise, and the quantity and quality of justice and protection will fall. Okay, so if the product they're offering, so to speak, is justice and protection, it's going to get worse, and we're going to pay more and more for it.
Right.
Okay.
And also, quality is going to fall as well, which is what I cared about, rather than necessarily the cost. You're going to get, less justice for what you need, or less anything else that it's supposed to provide, and it's now a monopoly. It's the quality that I think we emphasized a lot in the last 2 episodes.
Okay, and then he says something that should hit home for us in this last couple years here. He says the government is going to maximize expenditures on protection, and conceivably almost all of a nation's wealth can be consumed by the cost of protection, and at the same time to minimize the actual production of protection. So when the incentives line up that way, what would you expect? You would expect that the government would constantly be freaking us out with things that we need the government to protect us from, right? So there would be wars on this and wars on that, the war on poverty under LBJ, right? The war on terrorism starting under George W. Bush. There's just constantly, with the help of the intellectual class, as you may have noticed recently, with the help of the corporate media, the intellectuals, they're going to constantly try to keep the populace afraid and turning to the government for protection, right?
Right.
So that's the way the incentives line up, and I would say we are soaking in it to the point that it's becoming rather annoying. It's fair to say. Furthermore, he says if one can appeal exclusively to government for justice, justice will be distorted in favor of government, constitutions and appeals courts notwithstanding. So much like we've been talking about with some of our friends like Academic Agent and some of these great thinkers, realist thinkers in the Machiavellian tradition, the whole separation of powers things is a joke.
Yes.
The Supreme Court, the Congress, the president, they're all the government. And the idea that like one of them is really in our corner ultimately is absolutely an illusion. And I don't know how people who are in our circles could even hold on to that illusion at this point anymore. It should be pretty blown away, I would think.
And a lot of the skeptics of separating powers have often pointed out that creating competition within the government is only going to grow the government more. It's another incentive. So, if you delegate powers between branches, then each branch is going to eventually develop or expand in a way to where they can now have their own version of that power. And you've seen that the U.S. government just across the board.
Okay. All right. So now here we go. So everything we said just now is talking about both princely and democratic government. They're monopolists. They tax. They provide less justice at a higher cost over time. But he says they're also different in a fundamental respect. The decisive difference lies in the fact that entry into a princely government is systematically restricted by the prince's personal discretion, while under democracy, entry into and participation in government is open to everyone on equal terms. Okay? So anyone, not just a hereditary class of nobles, is permitted to become a government official and exercise any government function all the way up to that of prime minister or president. Now, this is the part that feels a little counterintuitive, and I think this is where classical liberals in some cases got befuddled. Because in economics, we typically praise free entry, right? We're anti-monopolist, right? The classical liberals are the original ones who stood against big government privilege. Big corporate privilege, so to speak. Because the king would grant them a monopoly on silk refining or whatever the heck, and then no one was allowed to compete with them. and you'd get the effects of monopoly that we already discussed, right? Higher prices, lower quality and quantity. So free entry is a check on that. And typically, a free market type, like a classical liberal or libertarian, will say, hey, we want free entry. We want there to be competition for the provision of goods. But as Hoppe says so memorably, this isn't competition for the provision of goods. This is competition for the provision of bads. That's rather different. This is free entry into competition for the production of bads. Totally different thing.
Right. So if you're arguing against a corporate monopoly that's backed by the government, you want free entry. You want to be able to enter the market as well. The solution to it isn't to just open up the corporation to anyone that wants to go in. I want to found my own and compete against it. And then they don't end up applying the same principle to the government. They just open up the government and to anyone rather than, analyzing the structure of the government.
Right. So now, what does this mean in democracy? Under democracy, everyone is equal insofar as entry into government is open to all on the same terms. But he says that equality is harmful, it turns out. The entry into producing bads, right? But it baffles and confuses us, rhetorically and ideologically, from the inequality that is still there, that is the one that matters. In a democracy, no personal privileges or privileged persons exist, unlike in a aristocratic regime, right? However, functional privileges and privileged functions exist. So as long as someone is in their official capacity, they win the election, they get appointed to the office, whatever, democratic government agents are governed and protected by public law and thereby occupy a privileged position vis-a-vis persons acting under the mere authority of private law. So this should be quite obvious if you think about it. We know, and sometimes we can even see it playing out in front of our eyes, we know that police aren't just like anybody else. We know that they're in a privileged position, right? And they can do things that if we did them, we would be in big trouble, right? Well, this doesn't just apply to police. This applies in many spheres. We know, for example, that Congress critters tend to somehow become mysteriously wealthy on salaries that don't explain the vast amounts of wealth they end up with.
Right.
Such mysterious accumulation of wealth, the IRS would nail you if you weren't a senator or a congressman, right?
And going even further, you can see that certain actions are sanctioned by the mere fact that they aren't prosecuted. If you are part of the correct group, you can essentially burn down a city and not have anything leveled against you.
Right.
As long as it's for the correct reason.
Yes, right. So, he says, privileges, discrimination, and protectionism do not disappear. To the contrary. Rather than being restricted to princes and nobles, privileges, discrimination, and protectionism can be exercised by and accorded to everyone, to anyone, right? So under democracy, exploitation does not disappear. This is just the classic maneuver that Sowell talks about. He says, look past the label that is put on things, right? Sowell might not have said this, but, the Patriot Act was not patriotic. It was terrible and un-American, right? And various things done for the sake of the children don't actually help the children, right? Well, free and equal democracy and all this wonderful happy talk doesn't change what's actually happening in a democratic system, which is some people have privilege and the rest of us don't. It's just the access to becoming one of those privileged people is different. The mechanism for getting into that group is different in a democratic system than in a monarchical or aristocratic system. But the exploitation doesn't disappear. He's going to argue it's actually a worse situation in the democratic system. And this brings us to what I used in the marketing. Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
And something else is in the monarchical system or in the aristocratic system, they will often be, those exceptions and those inequalities are often very formally listed out, usually in a set of laws or a code of laws or even in common law sometimes, depending on what era you're in. In the democratic system, formally everything is exactly the same. It's egalitarian. And then what you get are elites that end up doing the exact opposite of what they're telling the people to do. And then you get people that think they're on the right who point it out and think that they're scoring some big win against them, when in reality they're just like, the elites know that this is how the system works and has always worked. So long as we are under these two systems, it's not actually doing anything. So, like, if you pointed out that the king wasn't doing something that the peasants were doing, everyone would be like, well, yeah, they're the king. But in the modern day, if someone points out that, like, the politician isn't wearing a mask, or they're flying jets to go to a carbon conference, it's a fake outrage that gets generated, because people don't realize that the previously formal inequalities weren't abolished necessarily. They were just made informal.
Right. Exactly. So now we come to one of the major points that blew my mind when Hoppe made it, because I just had never thought about things this way. He says, instead of a prince who considers the country his private property, a temporary and interchangeable caretaker is put in monopolistic charge. So you still have this monopoly situation. It's just now, instead of someone who's in it for the long term, you have someone who's in it temporarily. And I've thought immediate objection in the U.S. context, probably a lot of other countries too. Well, yeah, but our senators and so forth are like ancient, right? They've been senators for like 40 years, right? And they're gonna die in office as like skeleton, undead zombies, you know. They look undead almost, some of them. But remember
Some
that
of them probably are.
Yeah. Remember that with the monarchical system, it's not even the life of the monarch that we're thinking about necessarily. It's actually that the monarch is handing this off to his children. You know, so his whole family has a generational interest. So even with politicians who are not term limited, they don't have the kind of investment and long-term interest that a monarchical system gives to the royal family. So he's put in monopolistic charge. The caretaker does not own the country, but as long as he is in office, he is permitted to use it to his and his protégés' advantage. So he owns its current use, but not its capital stock, which is economics speak for saying he doesn't own the long-term value of it. He can just use it.
Right.
So the analogy here is to think of someone who, rather than owning the home, is a renter of the home. And they're going to get the use of it briefly, but the long-term value is still owned by someone else. Right. And so they can kind of mess things up, and they don't care that much.
In non-economic terms, and more in like a political term or something along those lines, they aren't here to develop. They're here to loot and destroy. They aren't investing.
Right.
So they're getting what they can now before they die, because after they die or after they're not elected, it's gone.
Okay. So what does this mean? He says this doesn't eliminate exploitation, this split between the current use and the long-term use. Rather, it makes exploitation less calculating and carried out with little or no regard to the capital stock, the long-term value, right? In other words, it is short-sighted. So he says, sure, the monarch exploits, the royal family exploits, and the democratic office holder exploits. But the royal family has a long-term interest in the value, whereas the temporary caretaker democratic politician doesn't. They get to squeeze this while they can, and then let the next generation pay the bill, which we hear that a lot these days, right? When we look at government debt and so on and so forth, people are often saying everything's being pushed to our children, our grandchildren. They're going to be the ones shouldering this massive burden. Like we're spending now and the bill's going to come due later. That's right. That's what Hoppe is saying. He's saying that's what you get with democratic government. That's how the incentives line up, is squeeze it now, loot it now, and let somebody later pay the price, right? Okay,
Right.
so let's keep spinning this out. Sorry, did you have a comment?
No, nothing more. I don't think. I think he covered it quite well.
Okay, so both hereditary princes and democratic caretakers can increase their current spending by means of higher taxes. However, a prince tends to avoid increasing taxes if this leads to capital consumption. He gets into a little bit of economic speak here, but basically he's saying that you learn to only suck a little bit. To use the Godfather phrase, just let me wet my beak, right? I don't want to wipe your business out. I just want to just give me a little, okay? Right?
Right. You want to skim off the top so that
Yeah.
you don't hamper their productive capability.
Right. You don't want to drive people out of business. You just want to get a little taste of it, right? A little portion for you. He says, in contrast, a caretaker shows no such reluctance. While he owns the present tax revenue, he does not own the capital stock from which it is derived. Others do. Accordingly, under democratic conditions, taxation increases far beyond its level under princely rule. And that is a point I've often seen people made since we've been bringing up George III and the secession from Great Britain a lot. That's a point I've often seen people make, which is that the levels of taxation that are complained about in the Declaration of Independence and by the secessionists, we would love to have those levels of taxation that they thought were so terrible. We're so far beyond the levels of taxation that they felt were abuses.
Right. And this is where the founding fathers would have differed. They didn't see this, perhaps because they might have been more empirically minded rather than theoretically minded. Some of them. They didn't make this connection that a democracy or a non-monarchical system, an elected office, if you will, is going to have less incentive to keep taxes low, whereas the monarch, as we've laid out just now, will. So they made the famous rallying cry, no taxation without representation. And instead of campaigning to get rid of the taxes under this view, they campaigned to get representation, which in turn only increased the taxes. So
Right.
It's a great folly historically.
Yeah, we got representation. We got a lot of taxation. We don't want any of it. Okay, so don't need to beat this to death. I think you're getting the idea, but just to very quickly spin out two more consequences of this private owner prince versus the caretaker democratic politician. One more is debt. The democratic caretaker can enjoy all the benefits of higher current spending, while the liability and concurrent drop in property values falls upon others. So the prince assumes, oh yeah, I should have mentioned that. A prince assumes a liability against his personal property whenever he borrows from or sells bonds to the non-governmental public. But that isn't how it works with the democratic caretaker, right? So the prince borrows, and he's got to think about, how am I going to pay this back, right? Whereas the president borrows, or the Congress borrows, and we've got to pay it back, right? So you're busting apart the responsibility and authority. They've got the authority, we get the responsibility. It's not a very nice deal. Finally, there's the issue of the money supply. If you know anything about Austrian economists, we tend to be very concerned about money.
Right.
Tend to be hostile to the Federal Reserve and pro, gold and Bitcoin and non-government monies, right? Okay, so here again, the prince versus the caretaker works out differently. Unlike a prince, a democratic caretaker is concerned only with his immediate enrichment, for he does not own current and future tax revenues. He only owns the present tax revenues. So he's solely concerned with the present purchasing power of money. So by increasing the money supply, he can increase his present purchasing power. I mean, that's what counterfeiting does, right? Which is effectively what they do. I counterfeit some dollars, and now I can buy more, right? But the lower purchasing power that hits everybody else because of my counterfeiting, that gets borne in the future by others.
Yes.
So there's a
it's the
tendency
perfect
towards
looting mechanism.
there's a tendency towards money inflation under a democratic government, and boy, have we seen that, right? Okay, next part. Right, okay, so with free entry into and participation in government, the perversion of justice and protection, law and order, will proceed even faster under a democratic system than under a monarchical system. The notion of universal and immutable human rights, and in particular of property rights, essentially disappears and is replaced by that of law as government-made legislation and rights as government-given grants. Here, wait a sec. It's already in the car, so. Had to say something to my karate kids. Okay. Okay, so what do I want to say about this? Oh yeah, so now at one time it was sort of a part of American political theology, right? That our rights come from God and governments can't take them away. And the U.S. Constitution is just acknowledging that these rights exist. It's not establishing these rights, right? That was all sort of normal thinking back at the beginning of the country, I think. Well, now I very, very often hear people talk about, we have privileges and they can be taken away by the government at any point. Right?
Yeah.
Our freedom is a privilege, a government-granted privilege, which can be revoked, not because we engaged in criminal action, right? But just because they want to build back better or something.
Right. That's the whole state of emergency thing. They will. The way they frame it is they say we will revoke this right under this condition. But the issue with that phrasing, it's a redefinition of right because a right can't be revoked in its most natural sense. It is just something inherent that can be infringed on.
Right.
So look at the linguistic game. They aren't going to tell you we're going to infringe upon this, like something very inherent to you as a person under these conditions. We're just going to revoke the right. Well, you don't revoke rights, you revoke privileges. So it's another linguistic game, and it really changes the way the legal system works when you start redefining things like that. That's why after you get the present danger doctrine, the exact wording has just left me, and I was ranting about it the other day. Clear and present danger, that's it. Whenever you get that doctrine where they can start revoking rights, whenever something is happening, whenever something's about to happen, legally they stop being rights and they start being privileges. So what we have seen in the modern day is just they have realized that that's what it is, and they are just formalizing the definition. It's not rights, they are privileges. Because they have just been treating them as privileges. They aren't treating them as rights. Rights can't be revoked.
A personal note real quick. I'm just feeling proud of myself. So footnote 12 here on the fundamental distinction between law and legislation, which got hammered into my head. He mentions 3 books, or well, more than 3 books, but Freedom and the Law by Bruno Leoni, the Italian legal theorist. Hayek's Law, Legislation, Liberty in 2 volumes, and Murray Rothbard's The Ethics of Liberty. They all, he mentioned specifically volume 1, Rules and Order. Yeah, that's where Hayek really hits on the law versus legislation thing. I just was struck by this footnote and I highlighted it because I've actually read all of that. And it's rare for me to see a footnote like this where I'm like, yep, check, check, check. Yep, I read all those. Anyway, nice moment for me personally. Okay, anyway. Now. Okay. Rather than just redistributing income and wealth from civil society onto government by means of taxation, deficit financing, and money inflation, both hereditary princes and democratic caretakers can also use their monopoly of jurisdiction for the redistribution of income and wealth within civil society. Right? So our first thing we're thinking about is money is flowing from us to the government, right? Well, this is a different thing. This is where the government is deciding who the winners and losers are, so to speak, within civil society. Redistribution within society, right? But he says, so that can happen under both systems. But he says the incentives are quite different. So for the princely government, they face two disincentives to doing this kind of redistribution. The first is a logical one. Even though a prince ranks above everyone else, his rights too are private rights. Now, this is such a paradigm shift from what we've grown up with in the modern age. It's hard to think about. But the king is a private person in the monarchical system, and his rights are also private rights. He says, a somewhat elevated kind, but they're the same sort of thing, right?
Right.
So if a prince takes the property of one person and distributes it to another, he undermines the principle on which his own position and security relative to other princes rests. So there's a principle at stake that hurts him to undermine.
Right. This is why you can't have a.
Go ahead.
This is why you can't have a socialist king, because the very ideas behind it will necessitate that he not be a king.
Right.
Same thing here. You can't have a redistributionist king, which, it's not socialism in its entirety, just one part of it. You can't have a redistributionist king because the existence of a king necessitates that things not be redistributed, but rather unequal. It's a natural check against more radical ideologies, assuming that the king is strong enough to keep his position.
And so then secondly, from an economic point of view, all general income and wealth redistribution from the haves of something to the have-nots is counterproductive and reduces the overall value of the territory. So what comes to mind, because state mass murder, unfortunately, is my scholarly focus. What comes to mind is the collectivization under the Soviet Union, under Stalin, right? Agricultural collectivization, where they targeted the productive farmers. I mean, it sounds insane when I say it, but it's literally what happened. The kulaks, dekulakization. The kulaks were literally the farmers who were just good farmers.
Well, they were more than that. They were the good farmers that got their land because they were competent enough to farm it. Like that was their identity, was that they were what they were because they were good farmers.
Right. And they are the ones who end up targeted under the communists in the Soviet Union, right? So literally, the plan is we're going to take from the ones who are good at farming, and we're going to redistribute it to the ones who are not. That's literally what was happening, right? Okay. As you may or may not know, some people died of starvation in part because of that.
People.
Yeah, in one of the great crimes of the 20th century. And so the princes, he says, do have some redistribution, but they tend to give to the haves rather than to the have-nots. They attend to so-called social problems by reallocating labor cultivation, acculturation, and colonization policies rather than redistributing income and wealth. So, they do these things to benefit themselves, I'm sure, but ultimately, because they have this interest in the long-term value, they want to enhance the value of the kingdom overall, is what they're looking to do. In contrast, a democratic caretaker faces no logical obstacle to the redistribution of private property. Rather than involving himself with the preservation and improvement of capital values, he will be concerned primarily with the protection and advancement of his own position against the competition of new government entrants. By the way, one of the things that this might even be something for us to do sometime, Ryan, if you don't mind exploiting you as an American historian typecasting you a little bit. One of the things that I feel like has not gotten enough emphasis is the way that FDR used the New Deal to benefit those who were his political friends, friends and punish enemies. You probably are familiar with this point, right?
So,
but it'd be really worth it, don't you think, to maybe do a show sometime where we really spell this out. I mean, I know it in broad terms, but I bet you with a little digging, we could say, let's show you who exactly benefited from the New Deal and who got it, who got hurt by it, right?
it's Schmidt's law that politics is benefiting your friends and punishing your enemies.
Right.
It's just how it operates, unless you get someone that is just particularly counterproductive. Just like a little taste of what would happen in that series. Most of the people that voted against FDR were, the farmers. You got a few that liked his plan because he was offering them money, but a lot of them saw that a lot of the things that he had proposed, a lot of the things he campaigned on, not necessarily in the platform, because we'd get to that, would have just destroyed the American farming industry. And that's what happened when you get the Agricultural Adjustment Act and all the different presidential powers that come along with it. The voting bloc that went against him just got destroyed by government interference.
Right.
Especially in the Midwest.
Right. Yeah. So this is a story people don't know about Saint FDR. Remember, he said there were two things that limited the monarch in this redistribution. One is that his legitimacy as a private person with private property would be undermined by going against the principle of private property too openly, right? But the Democratic caretaker's legitimacy does not rest on the legitimacy of private property. It rests on the legitimacy of social or public property, right? So if he takes property from one person and gives it to another, he doesn't contradict his own ideological foundation. Rather, he affirms the supremacy of the different principle of social ownership. Now, here, hopefully you're catching this, he's not so subtly drawing putting democracy and socialism on a spectrum, right? There's sort of outright Bolshevik socialism on one end of the spectrum, but he's saying democracy is on its way. It's part of the same thing. It's just heading that way towards outright socialism.
Right.
The principle is the same. They're just at different points along the spectrum, right? So what is the result of this? Under democratic conditions, private law, which is the law of property and contract, that's sort of our basic law, right? It disappears as an independent domain of law, and it's absorbed into public government-made law, that is, legislation. And then he quotes the German socialist legal theorist. I missed that he was a socialist. Interesting. He said, from the perspective of a democratic caretaker, quote, private law is to be regarded only as a provisional and constantly decreasing range of private initiative, temporarily spared within the all-comprehending sphere of public law. And if that doesn't make you want to, anyway, be ready for things. Anyway, okay.
Yeah.
Frightening stuff. Okay, so ultimately all property is public property in this democratic system. Each established private property right is only provisionally valid and may be altered in accordance with the caretaker's unilateral determination of the requirements of public safety and Social Security. I just want to give a little hint of something I think we'll be covering on our next Econ Minis, which unfortunately is possibly going to be in December because of things going on in November. But anyway, there is a carbon pipeline being put right through the Corn Belt, and they're just grabbing up land, sending letters out to farmers saying, sorry, buddy, your land is gone. Your land is ours now because we got to, save the environment and build back better and green or whatever, right? Well, that's what happens under a democratic system. They just grab stuff because they've got some scheme they're up to, which is supposedly for all of our good or whatever.
Yep.
And if you say, well, wait a second, this is my private property. The law says blah, blah, blah. The democratic government says, we are the law. You can't really appeal to something higher than us.
Right. And, well, hence the name of the book, right? Democracy, the God.
Yes, right. It's a god. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, and then secondly, a caretaker is always under the pressure of political competition from others seeking to replace him. So whether to secure his present position or advance to another, he must award or promise to award privileges to groups rather than particular individuals. Voting blocks, right? We're always talking about special interests,
right.
Voting blocks, so forth. So his redistribution will be egalitarian rather than elitist. And as a result of democratic competition, the character structure of society will be progressively deformed.
Right, and so this kind of plays into one of the previous points as well. They don't try to get reelected because they necessarily did good. It's because they are popular, and there is a distinction. People don't necessarily care about like statistics or numbers or tangible evidence or anything of the sort. It's a popularity contest. So how much is he promising me? How much money is he offering to give me? How much legal protection is he offering? Will he let me burn down the city for some groups? These are all things that get handed out. It's not has life actually improved under him. No one, very few people actually go to support someone with that question in mind.
And then finally, he says, because this redistribution involves taking from a haver and giving to a non-haver, from haves to have-nots, the number of havers and producers declines, and that of non-havers and non-producers rises. So there's a shift over time from people being productive to people being consumers, pure consumers, right? Just living off welfare or getting living off political plunder, basically, which
Right.
I've seen an argument recently that 80% of the Fortune 500 would be in restructuring, bankruptcy, within a couple of years if they didn't have various government privileges propping them up. So, when I say, living off welfare, don't just think of like underclass, right? Also think of CEOs and
Right.
defense companies and people like this, right?
Right, and even they aren't as productive as they once were. I mean, look at the state of the U.S. military.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, but it's so diverse, Ryan. That's the important thing. Okay, so
Yeah.
so he says what's going to happen, the relative number of bad or not so good people and bad or not so good personal characteristics and habits will continually rise, and life in society will become increasingly less pleasant. Democracy will bring about social degeneration, corruption, and decay. So yeah, here's his line. I already hinted at it, but I got to read it because it's so great. Free competition in the production of goods is good. That's why we're pro the free market, right? But free competition in the production of bads is not. So it's so obvious when he says it, but I just never thought about things this way, right? For example, free competition in the torturing and killing of innocents, or free competition in counterfeiting or swindling, for instance, is not good. It is worse than bad. And so that's the problem with democracy. Anybody can become the king, briefly. Right?
Right.
And so he says democratic competition is indeed worse than bad.
And then, even under the democratic system, you do get multiple kings. It's not just the guy at the top that controls anything. I think the last presidency should have shown you that. There's a bunch of different shadow kings that will hang around in the administration and dictate things and no one even knows their name.
Right.
Like, even the big titles that people should know, the director of the FBI and the CIA, I doubt many people know who they are. You'll get a few, maybe a good proportion of our sphere would know who they are, but the general population would have no clue who they are, what they've done, or what they are doing. So there's that whole other layer there.
So he says, of course, people who covet other people's property will always exist. It's just the nature of mankind, right? But under princely rule, only one single person, the prince, can possibly act on the desire for another man's property. And it is this which makes him a potential danger and a bad. But in democratic system, by freeing up entry into government, everyone is permitted to openly express his desire for other men's property. And of course, we see this, right? It's put under various rhetorical tricks, but when you have a widely popular thing, I understand many people are supportive of socialized healthcare. well, more socialized than ours is already.
Right.
Is a very popular position, as I understand it. Well, what does that come down to? It's what do you say? Openly expressing a desire for other people's property, right? I don't want to pay for my medical care. I want to grab your property and pay for my medical care, right? Or
Right.
requisition doctors and make them work on me against their will, as opposed to paying them openly in the free market. He says everyone may openly covet everyone else's property as long as he appeals to democracy, and everyone may act on his desire for another man's property, provided that he finds entrance into government. Under democracy, everyone becomes a threat. So it's the war of all against all, right?
Yeah, that's kind of the best way to put it. Everyone becomes a threat under democracy. It's and that would further highlight what we were talking about in the last two episodes. The just how egalitarianism and democracy will destroy social bonds. This is
Right.
the other facet to that. Everyone is a competitor. Everyone is going to grab your property to pay for what they want. Whereas under like most other systems, that's either mitigated or it doesn't exist.
Right. Right. And the incentive instead is for cooperating with each other to our mutual benefit,
Right.
as opposed to
Right.
who can grab the quickest and the most from everybody else, right? Interesting strike on freedom of speech here. This is really interesting. We've been hearing this from Academic Agent lately, who's been making some rather intemperate remarks about our glorious free press. I don't know why you would be against the freedom of the press, But he says every demand is legitimate if it is proclaimed publicly under the special protection of, and he puts it in quotes, freedom of speech. Everything can be said and claimed, and everything is up for grab. Not even the seemingly most secure private property right is exempt from redistributive demands. And I would say, as Michael Malice emphasizes, up to and including your children. Right? Like you'd think
Right.
at one time that would have been sort of sacrosanct, we all agree that, child abuse is bad and children should be protected and all that. Well, now we've got people openly saying we should decide what your children should learn, not parents. Right? I'm like
Right.
quoting a candidate, right? Paraphrasing a candidate. We should have access to propagandize your children and our values. And you shouldn't be allowed to stop us. I mean, this is openly declared at this point.
Right, and if I may, the idea that the freedom of the press is essentially just a form of control. It's not actually freedom. It goes back much longer, a few centuries. But the person that outlined it, I think the most extensively would have been Oswald Spengler when he wrote that it was just the rule of the people that have the most money. And we can see that today. It is just the rule of the oligarchs. The press, by and large, will not put out a piece that goes against what the general idea is at the World Economic Forum or the United Nations. It is just the rule of the oligarchs. And just because of how the laws are, the ethos that surrounds freedom of the press, you can't actually do anything to break that stranglehold. And it is a stranglehold. It's freedom is one of the largest misnomers for how the press is organized today.
Right.
You can't break it. It's there by law. It is an oligarchy that is established under the pretense of having no oligarchy, which is quite the paradox. But it's how it operates.
Okay, so now we get to a couple things where he's really talking about properties of monarchy. A lot of this, as you may have noticed, is basically slamming democracy, but using that slamming to demonstrate how the monarchical system was relatively better, relatively less bad. So historically, the selection of a prince was through the accident of his noble birth, right? Now, this might sound meaningless if you believe in like blank slate theories of children, but anyone who's had a child, or 8 of them, can tell you that children are born and they already have like a personality. We don't inject the personality into them. It's more like we have a front seat as parents to the development of something that God gave us, right? That's really the
Right.
reality. So the king, say, has an oldest son, and that son is an introvert or an extrovert, or whatever random personality traits, etc., that a person might have. His only personal qualification was his upbringing as a future prince and a preserver of the dynasty. And he says this did not assure that a prince would not be bad and dangerous. But there's a couple things to remember. First, any prince who failed in his primary duty of preserving the dynasty, who wrecked or ruined the country, caused civil unrest, turmoil and strife, or otherwise endangered the position of the dynasty, faced an interesting risk. Now, I think Kanol Ladin might have mentioned this as well, as I recall. This comes back to the personal responsibility thing, right? You could be neutralized or assassinated by another member of your own family. This happened
Right.
historically quite a lot, right, Ryan?
Yes. Reformation Day was very recent. One of the main figures of that was George the Pious, who is the Margrave of Brandenburg. He famously came to power because he deposed his father, who was basically throwing away the family's fortune on things that didn't matter. So he and his brother ousted him. He got Brandenburg, and the brother got Ansbach, which is elsewhere in Germany. And this is just one example that was on the top of my head. This happened all the time.
So the father was basically like blowing the family fortune on
Yeah,
stupid spending, and not he was being very short term in his orientation.
Exactly. And
the
they
family
ousted
was
him,
like,
and
the family was like, he's going to leave us nothing if he keeps this up, right?
Yep, exactly.
And so out he went.
Yes. So, and then obviously these people were demonstrating just by that fact they had a lot more foresight than that father did. They went on to be, relatively well-known rulers, whose names are in the history books just because of what they did at the time. They weren't stupid. George the Pious, if you can tell by his name, he was quite the theologian. So these things happen, and whenever they do happen, it's not something to regret. Oh, look, the monarchy's failing. They had to depose a king. Well, actually, what just happened that you wouldn't happen in a democracy was some guy of a much higher caliber just took over the reins of what's going on. And how do we know that? Because he just did this.
Okay, so there's one more thing then. So not only can you be assassinated if you get out of line, but this accident of birth could produce somebody who's okay, right? He says the accident of a noble birth and a princely education also did not preclude that he might be a harmless dilettante or even a good and moral person. So, maybe not someone who's, wise and has all this foresight and all this great stuff like who the brothers you were talking about, but maybe he's, he isn't harming anything and he's basically going to pass things on. He's not going to make them better. He's not going to make them worse, but it'll just sort of pass through him to his family. The kingdom will pass on without being screwed up, That could happen. Or he might even be like a good guy. That could happen, right?
So we were talking about at the beginning with, noble birth, upbringing, how they were even the people in the middle, like not great, but not the terrible. Like even they outclass our current rulers.
Right.
The person I had in mind, who usually gets a lot of flack, but no one calls him the terrible, but no one also calls him the great. Henry VIII, the starter of the English Reformation, he often gets a lot of flack. The meme is that he started a church because he wanted to divorce a wife and have a son with someone else. In reality, if you actually look past the meme and into the history, he had an actual working knowledge of theology, and that's why he ended up going through with what he did. The man actually knew theology as well as what he needed to run the kingdom, at least as well as he did. In the modern day, if your politician isn't just an atheist on a mimetic talking point of, well, if God exists, then why does evil exist? They probably don't know theology, which, I mean, that's just kind of the caliber we're at. Some guy in the middle, just being fair to him, was way outclassed even the best people that we have today.
Mm. So what does democracy give us in contrast? He's saying that under the monarchical system, you might get a bad guy, you might get a average guy, you might get a good guy. If he's really bad, there's a check because the family might depose him or whatever. Interesting comment
Right.
from Politia. I gotta learn how to pronounce that right. Politia. He says even if it isn't family, the nobility would sometimes depose the king and replace him with a relative, thus getting rid of the bad king, but at the same time keeping some kind of continuity. So a very interesting point. That the aristocracy basically would go, okay, we don't see a way to keep this particular royal line in there without disaster, but we'll pick, someone who's a noble, a great lord, something like that. He seems like he's going to be better than these jokers, so we're going to switch. We're going to switch royal families, basically, right?
Right.
And this certainly happened. I'm not enough of a historian to throw out an example, but that does sound familiar to me.
Usually, the nobility ousting someone is a bit more rare than what we've been discussing, but the
Yes.
nobility actually choosing a competent leader is very common. Because what would often happen is you would get a young ruler who would go off to war, die, he doesn't have children or a successor, so then the nobility back at home will pick someone that is really talented from among their ranks,
Right.
has a family, and he now inherits what the previous king just lost.
Right. To keep the continuity. So, you could get various random kinds of people. They have this check on them that they're expected to not ruin everything. Democracy, though, virtually assures that only bad and dangerous men will ever rise to the top of government. Now, interesting, he quotes from H.L. Mencken, and I'm inclined to read it because H.L. Mencken is just, his writing is always a joy. So I think you would enjoy hearing some, and I might do it. But actually, I'm surprised, maybe I need to check the rest of the footnote. I'm surprised that he didn't mention what comes to my mind, which is the famous chapter 10 from Hayek's Road to Serfdom, which is called How the Worst Get on Top. And it's a really compelling chapter where he explains how in a democratic system, a democratic socialist system, basically, it will be the people who are, have an advantage in the production of bads, right? The people who will shamelessly and without conscience plunder. Those are the ones who are going to rise to the top. And I think we've certainly seen that. Mencken has a way of lightening things up while also sticking the knife in. So let's try this. Politicians seldom, if ever, get there into public office by merit alone, at least in democratic states. Sometimes, to be sure, it happens, but only by a kind of miracle. They are chosen normally for quite different reasons, the chief of which is simply their power to impress and enchant the intellectually underprivileged. Will any of them venture to tell the plain truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth about the situation of the country, foreign or domestic? Will any of them refrain from promises that he knows he can't fulfill, that no human being could fulfill? Will any of them utter a word, however obvious, that will alarm and alienate any of the huge pack of morons who cluster at the public trough, wallowing in the pap that grows thinner and thinner, hoping against hope? Answer: maybe for a few weeks at the start, but not after the issue is fairly joined and the struggle is on in earnest. They will all promise every man, woman, and child in the country whatever he, she, or it wants. They'll all be roving the land looking for chances to make the rich poor, to remedy the irremediable, to succor the unsuccorable, to unscramble the unscramblable, to deflogisticate the undeflogisticatable. They will all be curing warts by saying words over them and paying off the national debt with money that no one will have to earn. When one of them demonstrates that twice 2 is 5, another will prove that it is 6, 6.5, 10, 20. In brief, they will divest themselves from their character as sensible, candid, and truthful men, and become simply candidates for office, bent only on collaring votes. Most of them, before the uproar is over, will actually convince themselves The winner will be whoever promises the most with the least probability of delivering anything. Mencken really understood democratic politics.
Yep.
Okay, so let's see here. We're about to wrap it up because there's a last section where he goes into how to overthrow all this, and I didn't want to try to cover that, though it is, of course, of great interest. So let's see, finally. So the only task a government was ever supposed to assume of protecting our life and property, our caretakers do not perform. To the contrary, the higher the expenditures on social, public, and national security have risen, the more our private property rights have been eroded, the more our property has been expropriated, confiscated, destroyed, and depreciated, and the more we have been deprived of the very foundation of all protection, of personal independence, economic strength, and private wealth. While we have become ever more helpless, impoverished, threatened, and insecure, our rulers have become increasingly more corrupt, dangerously armed, and arrogant. That concludes his discussion of monarchy and democracy, and then he talks about what do we do now and gets into Etienne de la Boétie, which we did a great cigar stream on with Academic Agent. I recommend that to you. Yeah, so you know, there's a lot in there. I feel like one of the central points for me, central takeaways for me, and I'd be curious for your take on this, Ryan. A central point for me, like if I had to say one thing to people, like what is this thing about Hoppe saying monarchy is better than democracy? What can that even mean? If I just could make one quick point, it would be that caretaker versus long-term thing. That to me seems so foundational to his critique of democracy and his saying monarchy is relatively superior. The monarch, or maybe better to say the monarchical system, the royal family, the nobility, they have this long-term interest in not screwing things up so badly that they lose out on the benefits. In fact, Ryan, I'm going to switch us away from the text here.
All right.
Okay, there we go. So it's just us. Yeah, they have this interest in that, whereas in the democratic system, everybody's temporary. Everybody gets a little short, relatively brief chance to grab while they can, you know, to pay off their friends and hurt their enemies. And if that means that our grandchildren are impoverished, inherit some tremendous debt, inherit a country that is falling apart in so many ways, culturally, economically, and so forth, yeah, well, you know, they'll have to deal with that. Back, you know, those future people will have to deal with that. In the meantime, I'm lining my pockets, right? That to me, that caretaker versus long-term view is one of the things that stuck with me the strongest from Hoppe's critique. What about you?
Well, I was going to say the same thing. It's the difference between your rulers looting you and they only skimming off the top so that they can keep profiting and have their children profit. I was going to essentially bring up the exact same thing.
Right.
So,
right.
I suppose. Well, I mean, if we both
wastefulness and destruction of what we are experiencing, we're watching it play out.
Right. Yeah, there is a lot lost there, but I mean, ultimately,
what kind of system, Ryan, allows for what we saw with the BLM riots last year? Where literally the businesses and the cities are just being burned and destroyed, and as someone pointed out, everybody's like, "Oh, the insurance companies build it back." No. We've been through this before. We had riots in Detroit, and if you haven't checked it out lately, I understand that Detroit has not done very well in the long term, and it was doing really well until the Detroit race riots, and it has been on a long-term decline ever since. It never recovered. Will Kenosha, Wisconsin recover? Will, you know, these various places, Milwaukee and so forth, or these areas of town at least, will they ever recover from what happened last year? What kind of system are we in that sat back and basically watched it happen?
It's because it's a system that isn't concerned with governing, and there is a difference between governing and like the state. Governing is actually making sure that like justice is run properly and things along those lines. It's something that we're all interested in. The system is not interested in governing. It's interested in looting what is here. So that's why you get all these insane economic policies, tax developments, postulating about taxing unrealized gains and all this other
Yeah,
stuff.
exactly. Yeah,
Um,
yep.
they're here to loot. They're here to punish people that they fundamentally hate. So that's why they will allow these riots. That's why they'll allow the legal system to function in the way it does. It's why they will fortify and steal elections, no matter how brazen it is. It's because they are on top of trying to maintain power while they're still alive. They hate the people that they are up against and the people that they are trying to punish, and that's why they're trying to maintain it. So, with those two combined, it perfectly explains the way that everything is today. It's a combination of malice, short-sightedness, and greed. What kind of system would allow it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of the reason why I found Hoppe's sort of theoretical description so compelling, is that it didn't seem abstracted, even though it is sort of an abstract case, right? Hoppe tends to do things in a very deductive, logical way, right? So you'd think that he might develop something that doesn't feel very connected potentially to our life. But in fact, I read it and it was very logical and deductive and sound in terms of developing his argument. But also,
Right.
it described our reality. I'm like,
Yeah.
he's exactly describing what we've been watching happen with the United States. You know, as Ryan and I spelled out, and Tom DiLorenzo spelled out in the course of the Rise to Empire series, in particular with the rise of the Hamiltonian Lincolnian philosophy in America. It's been a long
Yep.
run slide away from a productive and sensible and culturally sound United States, for example, and into what we're seeing now, where the United States literally exports chaos, right? So you, with the BLM stuff, you have the British going, what is this BLM thing that's coming to our country that has no basis in our own history? It's literally an American thing, an American bit of chaos that got pumped over into other parts of the Western world, you know, or the Anglosphere or whatever. And they're just like,
Right.
what?
So, yeah, and just to be pedantic, BLM isn't necessarily American. It's more, it's a very Marxist in tone. So, it didn't have to be us. It could have been some other minority group somewhere else. It's just that it so happened that they were here,
Well, that's true.
and the opportunity was there. So, but yes, they are exporting it. There is a group. There is a bunch of shadow elites that aren't necessarily tied to country that will export this stuff so as to gain more power, more looting capability, and to punish the people that they hate. It's this whole thing is politics, and there are people that are not necessarily bound to borders to export it.
Right. Okay, well, I want to do super chats real quick and then see if these credits that I threw together finally scroll smoothly. They don't look as nice as the credits have looked, but they are they scroll nice. So we actually got great support this show, but you wouldn't see it on YouTube because it's from people who are subscribers at Subscribestar. And in addition to doing the regular subscription, which for almost everyone is just $5 a month, it's not very much. Some people will do like super chats, except they're called tips. And we got two. One of them from Leo Borealis, particularly generous, thank you, sir, is really long. And he asked that I just provide his essay to Ryan. But it seems to be.
I saw that.
Yeah, let me read like the first sentence just to tease everyone with it. The issue with Hoppe is the same intrinsically as with Hobbes. Hobbes' vision of monarchy, upon which Hoppe partially rests, is essentially false. And then he goes on to a very lengthy thing, which I will provide to Ryan. Nogardi also generously donates and says, the discussion of accountability got my programmer brain running. We discussed relationships between classes in terms of things like many to one to one, one to many, and many to many. He's talking programmer speak here. It seems to
Right.
me accountability can be one-to-one, for example, in a marriage, many-to-one, for example, a monarch to his people, or one-to-many, the ministers and bureaucrats to the monarch. Each of these have an effective way to hold the targets accountable. However, many-to-many cannot work because the responsibility is dispersed on both ends. Yeah, it's an interesting point, and it fits in nicely with Kanal-Ladin's emphasis on personal responsibility in the monarchical system and his critique of democracy, that you do your anonymous vote, one of millions of people. And, well, I voted for that guy and he ended up being terrible and kind of introducing more tyranny into our country. But I was just, my vote didn't really matter. So, the dispersed responsibility is what Nogardi talks about. And yeah, that's exactly what Kanal-Ladin was saying, I think. Well, I'll remember after we get off air to share the long essay with Ryan, and maybe we'll discuss that another time. Let's see. Okay, so I think I am unfortunately going to be unavailable for the next 2 weekends. We have Thanksgiving coming up in the United States in 2 weeks, and it's on Thursday every year. So that kind of kills us. And I've got other things going on. I'm going out of town and stuff. So that'll be hard. And this next Thursday, I probably am not available, is my expectation. So we are planning to do Econ Chat, hopefully with Ryan, if he's available, on Thursday, December 2nd, would be our next time. And Ryan will probably be doing some kind of Thanksgiving thing, because that's our tradition here in the United States. You scuttle back to your family and eat together.
Yeah.
From wherever
Or
you
if the
are.
family's if all of the family's close together, then you have many different families to jump between in the span of like 2 days.
Oh, right. Yeah. Multiple Thanksgivings, multiple Christmases, that kind of thing. Okay, so I think we're done for today. I imagined us going through all of Kanal-Ladin, but we've completed, I think, the most interesting part. And after this, unless you've gotten a different idea, after the first 4 chapters in which he critiques democracy and does democracy and monarchy, his next chapters, I'll just read the titles to you. Chapters 5, 6, and 7. Chapter 5 is The Political Temper of Catholic Nations. Chapter 6 is Huss, Luther, and National Socialism, the Genesis of a Totalitarian Movement, Part 1. And then Chapter 7 is The Rise of the National Socialist Party, the Genesis of a Totalitarian Movement, Part 2. Not that these things are uninteresting, but he goes from sort of high political theory in the first 4 chapters more to discussing some historically specific situations mid-century.
At a very Roman Catholic lens.
Yeah, with a super Catholic lens. And I may just be less interested in that for the show. There's actually other things by Kanal-Ladin that I'd be more inclined to cover on the show, like his book Leftism. From Desaad to Hitler or whatever.
That was my
really
introduction to Kanal-Ladin.
And then you think it's worthy of us to discuss, right?
Yes, definitely. But that might just be like sentimental value that I'm talking about. The rest of this book might be better fit for my channel, but of course, it's not going to be necessarily supportive in some cases.
Right. You'd be in dialogue with Kanal-Ladin.
Yeah.
To put it nicely. Okay. Anyway, thanks everybody. Americans, have a good Thanksgiving. I suspect we won't see each other until after that time. It's been great to get all the support as I defend de Luther. Jedi Knight Anakin Cringewalker says, right? And Leo Borealis invites us to deep lore. Deep lore. Wait, no, you have to meet us in our community. I think he means to say the Radical Liberation Community, which you can join. The front door of it is Discord. That is in the description of the video. And just recently, this week, somebody decided to get the investments. It's not called speculation, something like that. Yeah, but the discussion of what to invest and where to invest. We got a little discussion starting to kick up this week. So I think some people have an interest in that. So please do join the community if you haven't. Jump to the speculation channel, I think it's called, and join in. Some smart folks, some industry insiders are in there, and I think there's a lot to be learned. So please do join us there. And we're all set. Oh, Ryan has a channel, as he mentioned in passing. Subscribe to Ryan's channel. We're seeing how fast he can get what took me 2 years to get. Well, we're going to see if we can do it in like 3 months, You need to make more videos, I guess.
Yeah, that's it's in progress, don't worry.
Oh, good. Okay. But yeah, his channel has been taken off like a rocket. So definitely want to hook into that to get the Zoomer view, the based Zoomer view, right?
Sure.
Okay. Thanks everybody, and watch these credits.